next stop in this exploration into Stephen King's novellas that were turned into movies, we're actually going into a movie that I talked about when it first came out in 2017, I think. And I reviewed it back then, and I don't really remember what I said at all. I do remember really liking it. So we're just going to see how 3 years has aged it, if at all. And of course, it is the first story in Full Dark No Stars, which we will be talking about the three stories in here that have been adapted. And obviously, Fair Extension is kind of in the middle, and it's kind of its own thing that's only about 30 pages long. So I don't even know if that counts as a novella, but it's in here with these. So we'll basically be talking about pretty much the whole book. And Fair Extension might come up once or twice because a lot of the stories in Full Dark No Stars kind of have very similar themes going on. One in particular that we'll talk about here is the whole duality of people, just kind of in general, where all the main characters in the three stories that we're going to talk about here sort of have like double sides to them that they usually end up giving different names. And in this case, we're dealing with Thomas Jane's character, Wilfred, who sees another person inside of himself that he calls the Conniving Man. And that's going to be a continuing theme as we go through these next three we're going to talk about. When he says something along the lines of, there's another person inside of everybody. So we're going to kind of talk about all the different sides of people that come out in all these. But to start on 1922, of course we start with the movie in regards to its opening, because this is actually a really faithful adaptation that this movie has done. And we start off exactly as the story does, where he goes to a hotel and he's ready to write out a confession of everything that happened in 1922, about 6 years, I think, after everything happened. After he supposedly moved on with his life, but everything's kind of catching back up to him. Because everybody sooner or later gets caught, as he says many times. And what I really love about the execution of using narration in regards to him writing out his confession, and that's how we're being told the story, is that, well, first off, Thomas Jane gives us another really great Stephen King-based performance here, about exactly 10 years after The Mist. And what's really great about this narration is that it's him writing out this confession, and I love that the narration actually kind of sounds like that. It's drawn out just enough in the way he's speaking in the narration that it kind of comes off as if it's being written as he's saying it, and it actually sounds like that in the narration. I think that's a really nice touch. And another thing that really drives this movie home, and it's kind of like the real base of the movie, is not only Jane's performance in general, but how he just immediately comes off like he seems so of the era. Like, the movie came out in 2017, you look at Thomas Jane on screen, and you look like this guy is not even close to having ever seen 2017. He looks very much in this era, and you can say that about most of the things involved in this movie and the actors, because the production design is also really great. And obviously it was made for Netflix, so there was a time there before the King adaptations kind of really started helping them out, because Gerald's Game was right around the same time. There was a connotation there, and you can still put that connotation with it, that Netflix movies are mostly subpar and mostly look really cheap and made for TV or straight-to-video or whatever you want to call it. But they certainly have these moments where they really stand out. And I thought this was one of the earlier ones that like really was like, okay, if Netflix can keep doing stuff like this, maybe they will have something. Because there's like so many, as far as there's like great production values, and like I said, the actors they were able to get involved and the performance that they got out of it really brought this story to life in a really vivid way that you, kind of like what we talked about with the Langoliers, where you're not quite sure if it's how adaptable it is going in. And then it turns out this story is shockingly adaptable. So, as we start off, we have the very, very dark story. Like in the afterword of Full Dark No Stars, King almost kind of prides himself on the fact that the stories in Full Dark No Stars are really, really rough. He really, really went to some really dark places in this book. And this story definitely starts that off in a really effective way. Because we get, much like in the story, a brief but very informative introduction with not too much, clunky exposition or anything like that, to show us where he and his wife Arlette are in their marriage, and they have their son Henry, and everything seems like it might be fine and steady, but then there's a whole land thing going on, where she has this land she's inherited from her father, and this causes enough tension between them that he decides, I'm going to murder her, and I'm going to convince my son that he can help me. I'm going to basically turn him on her as much as I can, and then we will be able to... It almost feels like, I get Killer Joe vibes from the plot itself, and that's... and they're both, like, twisted in similar ways, also. And so, when you have this setup to get to this moment, because in both the movie and the story, the whole act of it, despite how much build-up there is to how we got to this point, that Wilfred's ready to do this, there's a lot of history to it and a lot of things that have led up to it, but it happens very quickly. Like, it's only about 20 pages into the story, if that the actual act of her murder takes place, and it's about maybe 20 to 25 minutes into the movie. It's, like, perfectly lined up. But there's just enough, and we get there quick enough, and they set up enough that it feels like we're pretty much immediately being thrust into what it is. It's just like, oh, you need to know this, and you need to know this, and then the brutal killing happens. And then it basically goes into being kind of the old the whole, like, trope, the getting away with murder story, where that's pretty much the gist of it, where a murder is committed and then the rest of it is tensions building as you attempt to cover that up, which is a very fascinating storyline to always go with. It's one of those things where it always leads way to, like, really, really heavy suspense. So if you're doing, like, a thriller, that's one of the great sort of familiar, like, plot lines to use. Only this one goes in some really, really twisted directions with it, which is great. So it just really expands on the whole idea in general. But talking about this character that they need to kill, Arlette, who is played by Molly Barker perfectly, where she's definitely got this sort of... I mean, she seems, like... A decent wife and a decent mother and all that. Like, to the point that you would never even think twice about seeing her if you just sort of saw this family in passing. But then as it goes, she's got this sort of coldness to her that's kind of done really subtly until the night where she gets kind of drunk and goes too far talking to Henry. And even in that sense, we get the sense... Like, we don't see anything really explicitly, but we get the sense that there's something really, really dark inside her. And that kind of gives us the vibe where we come to this turning point, where in the story it talks about how she slaps Henry, and the way he stares at her, it's like Wilfred knows in that moment, I've got him. I can get him to do this. And it's perfectly executed in the movie also, complete with a really over-the-top music cue. And most of the music cues in this movie are really over-the-top, and, like, really, really, like, loud. And while that would seem like almost manipulative in the bad sense, or being way too obvious, I actually think there's something about it that works. There's something eerie enough about it that it really works. Especially in a later moment when when Henry leaves, when he runs off with Shannon later. There's the whole thing where they have, like, when he knows that Henry's leaving, there's this sort of another big music cue where it's like there's almost like a nostalgic factor to it, and he has, like, sort of flashbacks to he and Henry being happy together and all that. And then when, like, the terror of the situation comes in, that music is immediately replaced with that same music cue from when after he got slapped by his mother. And that's stuff like I said, you can go really big and even be a little overbearing and still have it work. Just most of the time it doesn't, but if you have a skillful enough filmmaker and idea, then you actually can make that work. Now, when you actually get to the murder scene of this movie, It's interesting how, and you could tell us about the story also. What's really sort of terrifying is how there's sort of a bizarre realism to this, especially when you're hearing it as he's explaining it, as he's writing out the confession in the movie, in his narration, where he's talking about how I murdered my wife and my son aided me, and it's like he sounds like a news article, and it's like as soon as he says it in that way, in the words that he uses, you can imagine it being something you read in like a true crime book or something. And it's in the afterword, King mentions that he when he got the idea for 1922, he was looking at like a nonfiction book, and he like saw the faces of the people and just everything just felt like death, and he wanted to kind of give that tone to a story like this. And you really get that vibe, and then also the way Wilfred's able to like think on his feet, but also be really, really precise in planning, and can do both of those things that are the total opposite. Where this thing is like really, really thought out, whether it be what he was going to do, how he was going to cover it up, and the whole separate thing of building up to how he was going to get Henry involved. And it's like this very meticulous plan. But then you've also got the scenes like when everybody starts showing up and a lot of questions start coming his way, or you get to the scene towards the end when he finds the final ultimate cover-up and there is the body that's found in the ditch, and he's able to just immediately take that opportunity and just go with it, and just go into questioning like that. And it's like he's a really interesting character, but also intriguing in just how low he goes. And this is a lowness that we know immediately. It's one of the first things we know about him is how low he will go. But yet it still kind of surprises us how he's able to get to that point, and how he's able to keep up having gotten to that point in the aftermath of it. And there's another thing about this story, and it's certainly prominent in the movie, but I think it's more prominent in the story. And that's the use, and you would think this would be something I'd say about the movie, but it's actually the book, is the use of, like, gore. Like, the whole descriptions of Arlette at the bottom of the well, and when the rats come in. Because obviously rats are going to play a big factor in what's sort of, like, the main scare factor of the movie. And this is obviously a much more effective use of King using rats than, say, Graveyard Shift. But of course that was the first one we talked about in the last King series we did. But yeah, so when you look at stuff like this, you would think, you know, like an argument a lot of people make about horror movies or stories that focus on gore is gore isn't scary. Like, gore is used for gross out factor. But there are cases where I've defended, and 1922 is certainly one of them, where gore can be scary. Especially with the way it really suits 1922, especially, is the kind of horror we're talking about and the kind of terror we're talking about. Because we're talking about being, like, haunted. Because the whole thing is he gets an image in his head of Arlette at the bottom of the well. And there's things where, like, when you see something that's, like, really gruesome or something that just really churns your stomach, it etches itself in your mind and you can't get rid of it. No matter how hard you try and how much you desperately want to, it will just stay there. And that haunts you in the sense that he's actually being haunted by Arlette, potentially. So when we get the images that we get in the story of, like, her jaw is coming off and a rat, like, comes out of her mouth, and all that stuff, and it gets, like, really, really into the details. Like, we do have the moment in the movie when the rat is chewing off the, like, where the udder is on the cow. And it's like it's just kind of hanging there and then the rat runs away. But in the book, he goes into this whole thing of it was hanging out of the rat's mouth like a cigar as he ran around. And it gets, like, really, really twisted in the description. Like I said, that's the thing, though, is you put these images in people's minds that they desperately don't want to see. Once they've seen it, it's there. And they can't take it back. They can't unsee it, and then it becomes haunting in the way that the story, all these things in the story are to the main character himself. Like, that's the whole story, is him being haunted by those images and how the rats just keep appearing and appearing. And the whole ambiguous nature of sometimes maybe they're just hallucinations, sometimes maybe they're actually there. We don't really know. which is great. Going into this also, we have the side characters, one of which is Harlan, Shannon's dad, and he is played very well by Neil McDonough, the very reliable Neil McDonough. And that's something where I kind of got a vibe of Fair Extension also, where he talks about his sort of envy of Harlan and how he's sort of got everything just right, where it's like he has everything that Wilfred used to have before everything got to this point. And there's something that's pretty much the whole idea of the story Fair Extension, that's in the middle of the book. So there's that sort of connecting of the stories also. And then you get to, we have some really great lines in here. Like King is one of those people where it's like, you have the horror story and you also have some really emotional sides or perhaps something really profound being said. And then there's sometimes where he'll just drop a one line on you. And it's just this really memorable moment, whether it be, the one that really always stood out was when he's being questioned about Arlette's disappearance. And he says that she's as easy to, trying to nail her down as like trying to nail jelly to the floor. Which is one of those lines where it's like, you can absolutely see that line coming from this era, but you can also see it coming directly from King. It's like either one is really believable. And then there's also stuff like, it's just random shit, like waiting for a teenage boy to come to his senses is like waiting for a broomstick to sprout flowers. It's like, who thinks of an analogy like that? But yet somehow it still works anyway. And it almost gives it like this whole sort of storybook kind of quality we have going also. But then there's also like, I guess I also didn't mention as far as technical aspects the use of sound. Because we were kind of talking about the gore, and how that actually works. And then we get stuff like when Arlette does confront him again and gives him the visions of where Henry and Shannon went and what happened to them. And the way her mouth opens when she whispers to him is like the way it creaks. Like, this is the kind of thing where you expect that kind of detail in a story, like in a novel, but you don't expect it to be able to translate to a screen version. And it came out so disgustingly, terrifyingly perfect. Just where a little bit of a sound effect can go and how much of an impact it can give a scene, and add a whole other layer to it. And then on top of that, we do get this whole sequence of seeing what happened when, Henry and Shannon basically do the whole Bonnie and Clyde thing. And there's something, like, I was talking about this being a made-for-Netflix movie, but it's like, this whole sequence is, like, so satisfyingly cinematic. When we see how Henry and Shannon started on this, and then just all the way to their death. It's like its own short film in the middle of the movie. Which is really good. Because that's another thing where it kind of feels like when you're reading it in the novel, you almost kind of think, like, it almost feels like it's branching off a little too much. It's King doing that thing where he kind of overwrites, maybe sometimes. Unless you're like me and you'll just say, it's obvious this guy just loves telling stories, so just, if this one tiny little character that has nothing to do with anything sprouts a whole backstory he's going to give us, go right ahead. But here, specifically, going on that, it almost feels like it's going to be one of those things, but then as it goes and goes and builds to what all happened, and how it ended up resulting all the way into their deaths, and it's suddenly, you go back and you, like, start that from the beginning again, and you realize just how we're told, like, this seemingly epic story that was in such a short period of time. And it's, yeah, so that was incredibly well done. And then by the time we get towards the end, and Wilfred's losing his mind, some of the things they do in both the story and movie to kind of put us in that position also, like, when, obviously you know what's going on if you read the story, but like the moment when he's in his house and the cow just sort of walks through the frame while he's inside. It's like people who read the story know that the cow just came inside and decided to stay there and started staying there to get out of the cold or whatever. But it's like, in that particular moment, and where we are as an audience and where Wilfred is in the story, when that cow walks by, it feels so much like a hallucination. And I feel like the idea is maybe Wilfred in that moment doesn't quite know either. Like, he's just completely surrendered to the fact of, I'm seeing some shit, and it might be there and it might not be there. who the hell knows anymore. Maybe I'm insane, or maybe not, I don't know. I mean, it's clear he's insane to an extent, really before we even start. But to the degree that that builds is what the satisfying part is. And the way that this is basically, like, everything that happens to him for the rest of the movie is, like, you know, comeuppance after comeuppance, and karma after karma, and so on. And then I really liked the choice that the movie made to bring in some of the dialogue we recognize from the story, and bring it in these last moments, like right before it ends, and Wilfred's kind of reaching his peak insanity when the rats are starting to come through the walls in his hotel room, and it's this perfect. Like I said, this is such a, as far as adaptations go, this is really like top tier. Being able to pull all this off and bring in those exaggerated feelings and make them feel like, are they real or are they not? But these moments when he's having these flashbacks to him and Henry's dialogue of, you know, like, is there a heaven and is there a hell? And then it's like people like us want there to not be a heaven so that there's not a hell. And then when Wilfred tells him that he loves him, his response is, well, I don't deserve it. And it's like, that's pretty much the perfect place to put that exchange, to bring it back in, like, the final moments. And it's like going to be the last things that Wilfred thinks about. And remembers about his son before he is wherever. In the story, it's semi-confirmed, more so than the movie. The movie ends on a really nice ambiguous note, where we kind of talked about this when we talked about Shawshank, the idea of, do you end on the ambiguous note, or do you go a little further, and if going a little further will be a better payoff or not. As far as Shawshank went, this is actually the reverse, and it's the book. The book doesn't end on the well, there's still the ambiguity, but as far as, is Wilfred, like, dead or not? Of course, the book ends on a news article about Henry having, or Wilfred having committed suicide, supposedly. It's even written in that style. And it's like the whole thing where they go through and it's like he committed suicide by, like, biting himself as if they were rat bites. But then there's other things in here where it talks about how, like, there's just little tiny hints that maybe him seeing things wasn't entirely him seeing things. And it's, like, kind of the perfect way to go out on. But I do love the ambiguous note the movie ends on also, where he just sees them standing in front of him and the rats are closing in, and we just stop. Like, we know he's reached some sort of fate, probably death. So that's a case where either one works for me, but I do think, I like the way the news article works, because of the way they put those little things in, where it seems definitive, by saying, yep, Wilfred died, and apparently appears to have committed suicide. But just the little details in there where they're like, but is it what it seems to the people that wrote the article and the people that investigated? And like, if they knew what we knew, would it be a different conclusion? So, yeah, so this would have been a story where it would have been really easy for them to take a lot of liberties. But I actually feel like it's actually kind of ballsy how faithful it is. Because it's, like, really, really damn faithful. A lot of the dialogue is pretty much exactly the way it was. The way they play with the rats and, like, are these things that he's seeing, or are these things that are more, or hallucinations, or supernatural. Like, there's so many different things here. And it's a really damn freaky story, and it definitely works, really hits that impact. Well, like I said, also having these profound moments about, like, you know, family and fathers and sons in particular, and in Harlan's case, fathers and daughters, and the tragedy of all that, and just, like, tragedies that just pile on. Because by the end, we're getting, like, really, really brutal, like, hearing, like, how Harlan lost his farm to the bank and stuff like that. And, like I said, takes us to real places of tragedy. Like I said, also real places of, like, horror. Like I said, when they kill her, it sounds like he's describing something that would have actually been in, like, a history book or a true crime book or something. Which just adds a whole other level of horror to it. So yes, I really like the story, and I really, really like this movie, too. So, I guess we'll leave that at that, and then we will go into the second story in Full Art No Stars, and go from there. So until that, I think that's it for this.